are, so help yourself to another plate of salad or pasta over there. For those of you who have not met me, my name is Kaylee Vita. I am the Associate Director of Lifelong Learning for the Office of External Programs here at Perkins. It is an honor for me to introduce to you our 2025 United Methodist Studies lecturer. And following the lecture, Dr. Boggan will be joined for dialogue by Perkins' own Dr. Emily Nelms-Chastain, the Assistant Professor of Christian History and Methodist Studies, and esteemed author and church historian, Ms. Greta McKelvey. Dr. Ashley Boggan is the General Secretary of the General Commission on Archives and History. Boggan earned her PhD from Drew Theological School's Graduate Division of Religion, specializing in both Methodist, Wesleyan Studies, and Women's Gender Studies. She earned an MA from the University of Chicago's Divinity School, specializing in American Religious History. She has previously worked as staff at the General Commission on Archives and History from 2012 to 2014, and the Connectional Table of the United Methodist Church from 2014 to 2016. She was the Director of United Methodist Studies and Assistant Professor of Christian History at Hood Theological Seminary from 2017 to 2019, and was the Director of Women's and Gender Studies and Assistant Professor of Religion at High Point University from 2019 to 2020. Boggan is a lay member of the Greater New Jersey Annual Conference and the daughter of two ordained United Methodist ministers. Boggan is on the advisory board for the National Museum of American Religion and is the author of Nevertheless, American Methodists and Women's Rights, Entangled, A History of American Methodism, Politics, and Sexuality, Wesleyan Vile-tality, Reclaiming the Heart of Methodist Identity, and she was asked to revise the American Methodism, A Compact History. And most recently, she co-authored the book, Calling on Fire, Reclaiming the Method of Methodism. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ashley Boggan to SMU.
Good afternoon, Perkins. I'd like to thank Dean Brian Stone and Bart Patton and the faculty and staff of Perkins School of Theology for the invitation to be with you all. Today. Thank you, Bart. This afternoon, we are going to dive into our heritage, wrestle with it, and use it as a lens to discern our future. The bulk of today's talk comes from two books that were released this year. These books work in tandem with one another and are the product really of a pilgrimage to Bristol, England, where I had an unexpected transformation of faith, a new path of scholarship, and a new lens through which to think about the United Methodist Church. Now, within the Christian tradition, being Wesleyan and or Methodist calls us to actively stand as a beacon of justice in this world. You cannot identify as Wesleyan or Methodist without constantly seeking to ensure that all people, no matter who they are, how they identify, where they come from, or whom they love, feel worthy of God's love, have their basic physical and bodily needs met, and have the ability to seek happiness and perfection in Jesus Christ. If we are truly living into this call of our faith, we will be known as a people who bend to the rules and push the boundaries of society to ensure that God's love is continuously felt. This is a core aspect of our identity, one that I make the argument that we've lost, and the one that we need to reclaim. I sum it up in the phrase Wesleyan vile-tality, and define it as that willingness to look beyond today's acceptable practices, standards, and norms, and bend the rules in order to ensure that more and more persons can be included within the kingdom of God, and that all persons, no matter who they are, how they identify, whom they love, or how they live, can know and experience the love of God, can know their own self-worth, and grow to love themselves so that they can love others. Now, this sense of vile-tality was first evident with John Wesley during his days at Oxford. When the moniker Methodist begins to be used, it describes a group of about 4 or 5 people, Some of them were students. John happened to be a fellow at Lincoln College, but all of them were associated in some way with Oxford University. Now, John's younger brother, Charles Wesley, was a student, and Charles began a weekly pietistic study group on campus. And John, kind of one being the older brother, but two being the personality that John was, quickly took that group over. John, during this time, is discerning his call to faith. And he's trying to figure out how he's going to live into being the brand plucked from the burning that his mother always called him. So he's looking around and finding, discerning what is his call. At first, he thinks it might be this small group, this holy club. This holy club was known for their peculiar method of doing religion. They rose early, they studied intensely, they prayed incessantly, they fasted, they talked openly about their spirituality, and then they started doing even more peculiar things, visiting the sick and the imprisoned. And this was weird in the 18th century. Most people back then, if they went to church or were even welcomed into a sanctuary, sat down, listened to scripture, did their best to stay awake through a sermon, and left. There was no action required of them except filling a seat in the pew on Sunday morning. And even then, this privilege was reserved for a select few persons, those who had the proper dress or were clean enough to enter the parish, and those who had the geographical access to a parish, and those who had the Sabbath off from their labor. In the 18th century, the idea of faith existing beyond the walls of a church was anathema. The idea of faith being something that was lived out, acted out, embodied, that began to challenge the status quo. At a place like Oxford, it's not only these prior named disciplined acts of social transgression that made these Methodists a bit weird. It was also their willingness to break the political norms of the day by leaving the walls of Oxford and going beyond them to where the people were, the poor, the outcast, the imprisoned. And they not only began to breach those physical walls, but they began to transgress the religio, political, and social boundaries of whom was deemed worthy of God's love. They began to preach with these folks, to minister with them, and to ask them what their spirit needed. For this, John and this group were called many things before they earned the name Methodist. Bible moths, sacramentarians, supererogationists, and the Holy Club. All of these were tossed around to describe them, and all with a derisive connotation. But as we're thinking about what it means to reclaim our Methodist identity, it's important to point out when the first use of the word Methodist was used to describe John and this group. British Methodist historian Peter Forsyth has found what he believes is the earliest written, published use of the term Methodist to describe John Wesley and the Holy Club. It was printed in the Fogg's Weekly Journal, an Oxford newspaper, in December of 1732. After listing the various rules of this group, the story then goes on to state, quote, "As these Methodists have occasioned no small stir in Oxford, so there has not been wanting a variety of conjectures about them. And as several would be desirous to know our opinion of their rise, it may not be improper to acquaint you with them, which are summed up in a few lines of Ennius." Now the few lines are then written in Latin. I'm an American religious scholar. I do not read Latin, but ChatGPT does. And ChatGPT translates this Latin as the following: "They are not divine by knowledge or by skill, but are superstitious prophets, shameless diviners, madmen, those whom poverty compels." So let's just say that from the early days in this first rise of Methodism, This group was seen as a bit quirky. But from the date attached to this editorial in the Font's Weekly Journal, we learn that it's written in November of 1732. And the small stir that is referenced here relates to the Methodists, or well, I guess the Holy Club beginning to do prison ministry. They began to do this through the suggestion of William Morgan. They would visit the prisons, bring food, medicine, reading materials, pray with them, and about once a month have an actual religious service for them. And when they saw inhumane treatment directed at those who had no other options before them, this Holy Club took it upon themselves to hold the authorities accountable. And every now and then, their actions went a bit further, and they began to experiment with legal advocacy on behalf of a select few. This was the case when John Wesley and John Clayton took a particular interest in an inmate named Thomas Blair. Thomas Blair was imprisoned at the Bocardo and was on death row for having a sexual relationship with another man. Wesley and his friend John Clayton believed that Mr. Blair was being further victimized by his fellow inmates and the guards because of his alleged crime. Letters written between Clayton and Wesley show that they took a particular interest in Blair's trial. They talked about marshaling his evidence and seeking to ensure that this case would convince any reasonable person of Blair's innocence. On the day of the trial, John Wesley rose at 4 a.m. and rode 12 miles on his horse to be present. Now, unfortunately, Mr. Blair was found guilty, but his life was spared, and he was fined 20 marks. It's about 5,000 pounds in today's currency. Unable, though, to raise the fine from behind bars, who do you all think raised the money to get him out? John Wesley. Now, there are a lot of things that people take from this story. One thing that we can definitely take away is that John Wesley was deemed guilty in the public's eye through ministry with and defense of Blair. Wesley was concerned above all with how Blair was being treated by others. He knew that Blair, for the crime that this paper called too indelicate to mention, would be targeted for multiple forms of harassment and unfair treatment. And Wesley knew that that was wrong. So in order to ensure that Blair felt worthy of God's love, the love of neighbor, and love of himself, Wesley was willing to risk all. Peter Forsyth describes this unrelenting, unconditional defense of all persons as the act of public witness that, quote, tipped the balance between the Methodists being tolerated and being castigated. After their defense of Blair, the Holy Club was ridiculed even more for their weird way of doing religion, for their method that upended the norm and bent the rules by living out the love of God through intentional reach to those most in need. And Peter Forsyth concludes his article quite powerfully when he says, Wesley and his Oxford friends' eccentricities might be tolerated. Their excessive religious observance, their closed group intensity, their self-denial and strict code of living, reminiscent of some of the wayward Puritan sects of the previous century. Even their lowering themselves to undertake good works in the prisons and the workhouse was not beyond the pale. But it seems that when they took up the advocacy of a man accused of sexual crimes, they crossed the boundary between the bizarre but tolerable to the reprehensible. As we are discerning what it means to be Methodist, to be Wesleyan, to be United Methodist, I find it striking that we do not all know this story. Just to be clear, the article that is printed in the Oxford newspaper, which ridicules Wesley for causing this no small stir in his ministry with Blair, is the first time that the word Methodist is written and used to describe John Wesley and this group. This is how we got our name. This is what it means to be Methodist. And this is the message of God's love of all persons that we all need to reclaim. Now, after Oxford, John continues to kind of struggle with how to live out his call. A few years later, on May 24th, 1738, we all know that John Wesley is finally assured of God's love of him when he feels his heart strangely warmed. And yet, while he's assured of God's love, he also is sure that he does not want to be a parish priest. This is where the town of Bristol comes into play. Now, Bristol, England is a seaport town, and in John Wesley's day, it was the main port for the Atlantic slave trade. It was the second largest city behind London, and is the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. It is surrounded by coal mines and is massively overcrowded. Its walls were built to sustain about 5,000 people, but because of migration shifts and industry shifts, it now contained 40,000 people. And remember, this is the 1730s and 40s. There is no sanitation system. There is no sewage system. And the air is described as just thick and smelly. Wesley gets called to this lovely seaport town of Bristol in March of 1739 by his longtime frenemy, George Whitefield. Now, George Whitefield was originally a part of the Holy Club and had been in Bristol for a couple of weeks, preaching allegedly 40 sermons a week to tens of thousands of people. And Whitefield starts to get a little bit tired. So he starts writing to his friends to come down and assist him. At first, he writes Charles Wesley. And Charles says, "I'm not going to Bristol. Have you been there?" And then he writes a few others. John Wesley was not his second choice, or third, or fourth. John Wesley was his fifth choice. But John goes. John arrives on March 31st and is astounded to find Whitefield preaching to thousands, not inside of a church, but in the fields. And John does what he knew how to do, and he goes to his journal to reflect, and he writes, "I scarcely could reconcile myself to this strange way of preaching in the fields." You see, up until this point, John had at least followed the preaching standards of his day. He writes again, "I had been all my life, till very lately, so tenacious of every point relating to decency and order, that I should have thought the saving of souls a sin if it had not been done inside the walls of a church." But John sees the effect that Whitefield's preaching has. And so, 2 days later, he does something he thought he never would. At 4 in the afternoon, I submitted to be more vile, and proclaimed in the highways the glad tidings of salvation, speaking from a little eminence in the ground adjoining to the city, to about 3,000 people. Now, some of you may have heard me tell this story over and over, and I tell it because it is the moment when Methodism begins. It is the moment when John Wesley finally finds his true calling. And we know that because of this quote. So we're going to dissect this quote a little bit. First, that word submitted. This word is used intentionally. John did not want to do this, but he felt called by God to go into the fields, to go to the people who had yet to hear of the love of God. And while John's message of God's radical love was already getting him some negative attention from the church authorities, he knew that taking this message to the literal outdoors would definitely get him in trouble. But he did it anyway, because God called him and compelled him to go where he did not want to. He sees a missional need. He sees a people in need of the message of God's love. And he sees the effect that Whitefield's having on them. So he cannot resist the Spirit. So he submits to it. Now let's deal with that really wonderful word, vile. When we hear this word in its adjective form, we tend to think of someone or something dirty, disgusting, unseemly. And this is definitely what was on John Wesley's mind when he uses this word. John was still very much an Oxford Don, raised in the upper echelons of British society and highly educated. While he did not keep much money to his own name, few people would think of John Wesley as a person without means. As an ordained clergy person and an Oxford Fellow, he represents the state, the church, and the educated elite. And yet, here he is, about to preach in a really dirty field to the poorest folks in all of England, from one of the smelliest towns in the Western world. And while John didn't want to do this to begin with, he definitely didn't want to do it in a place that was so filthy. So vile seems like an appropriate word. Vile can also be used as an adverb. It can describe certain actions as morally reprehensible against the standards of society. And in this sense of the word, John is knowingly violating decorum. He's not only putting himself in a place that is vile, but acting in a way that is vile. And Wesley uses this word to show that he knows he is upending social and religious norms. In this moment, with this decision to preach in the fields, he is telling members of the Church of England, the landed and the elite, who worship in St. Paul's in London, that the poor and illiterate coal miners of lower classes are equal to them. He's naming that both are worthy of God's love. And this is such a transgressive, missionally prophetic, and yes, even vile thing to do. And it was perceived as such. Wesley knew that this action would get him some negative attention, specifically from the Bishop of Bristol, and he was correct. The bishop inquires pretty quickly after word got around that Wesley was preaching in the fields of Bristol. Wesley receives a letter from the bishop that essentially says, quote, "You have no business here. You are not commissioned to preach in this diocese. Therefore, I advise you to go hence." I hope none of you ever get a letter from your bishop that says this. But if you do, you can quote John Wesley. John Wesley said, do not quote Dr. Ashley Boggan, quote John Wesley. These are his words, not mine. "Sir, I look upon the world as my parish. My Lord, my business on earth is to do what good I can. Wherever, therefore, I think I can do the most good, there must I stay, so long as I think so. At present, I think I can do the most good here. Therefore, here I stay." With this response to the bishop, Wesley is stating that following the love of God or the movement of the Holy Spirit cannot be confined by the boundaries of a region, the walls of a church, or the rules of an institution. God's love cannot be confined to human-made space. And the love of God often takes us places we had never intended to go. Places we thought we might never venture to. Places we might prefer not to be seen in. So here, Wesley is speaking to the limitlessness of God's love in and through us. He's speaking to that dichotomous work of the Holy Spirit, comforting us with God's love and pulling us to places that are uncomfortable. For we cannot be settled when we are called. Instead, we must go. Go wherever we are being pulled, because the parish is not limited to the church. Now, within 3 days of being in Bristol, John's entire framework of how to preach, where to preach, and what is proper versus what is missionally prophetic is wholly overthrown. This experience shakes his foundational understanding of normativity, of acceptability, and replaces it with a desire to follow God wherever God takes him, and to meet the people wherever they are. My colleague David Worthington sums it up brilliantly when he says that while John Wesley's heart was strangely warmed in London, it was set afire in Bristol. And when you sit down and read John Wesley's journal, you see a stark difference between pre-Bristol and post-Bristol John. April through June of 1739 completely changes the course of the people called Methodist. Within 1 month of preaching in the fields for the first time, John breaks ground on the first Methodist building in the world, called, very creatively, the New Room. It was constructed to provide a centralized space for those who had been converted to come and to have their faith nurtured. It functioned as a preaching house, a place for bands and classes to gather, as a library, a medical dispensary, and essentially whatever the community needed it to be. We see both an inner and an outer change in John in these few months of the late spring of 1739. After preaching in the fields, he finally realizes how the people called Methodist are going to be different. He finally figures out what the method of Methodism will be. And it's centered upon putting folks in connection with one another. You see, George Whitefield was known as a better preacher than John. But Whitefield often preached and then left. He awakened souls, but didn't tend to souls. John sought to nurture faith. And the way to do this in the 18th century was to put folks in connection with one another. So it's in Bristol that John first experiments with adapting the Moravian bands for Methodism. He gathers those who had been awakened into small groups and gives them the task of watching over one another in love. They began practicing healthy accountability, not a form of accountability where if you falter, you are cast out, but the type of accountability where you walk with one another in good times and in bad. The type of accountability that allows for true vulnerability and trust. Putting people in these intimate groups was transformative for most. Now lately I've been asked to kind of dive into the history of connectionalism. And now that dive isn't really ready for a talk like this, but I can't help but bring up some of the things that are going through my head as I think about these small groups and this being in connection with one another versus connectionalism. Is there a difference between being in connection, being a connectional people, and being a denomination that adheres to connectionalism? So what I'm kind of playing with right now is looking at the relationships and the ministries of these early bands, the structures that were created, but really the micro-communities that were created. And looking at how we shift from identifying community as being in connection, to describing a movement as connectional, to describing an institution or a system as connectionalism. We could easily overlay the shifts in the language about being in connection over and against the decline of the class meeting, the rise in respectability, and what I would name as the decline of vile-tality. Now, if you need to stick with that and wonder a bit, please do. I'm still teasing all of this out in my head for now, but I want to kind of pick back up on this method of Methodism. Now, in the 18th century, there were population shifts from rural to urban settings that disrupted the previously understood forms of community. Wesley, with the bands and later on his classes, offers a new type of community, a new family. Wesley is not telling folks that they are worthy, not only telling folks that they are worthy of God's love, but is also creating space for earthly intimacy. He's also daring to give those folks agency over their futures, supporting them as they support one another. He asks those awakened souls what they needed beyond spiritual formation and works alongside them to implement change and experiment with missional solutions. This experimentation leads to a school for coal miners' children, an orphanage and a widow's home, and a medical clinic. Wesley then begins to create new roles for these folks so that they have agency in their mission. He creates the steward, the class leader, the housekeeper. And for these leadership roles, he doesn't look for the best and brightest. He works with folks to discern their gifts and graces given to them by God. He put his faith in the knowledge that God works through all of us. We just have to be willing to give everybody a chance at leadership. My clergy colleague and I, Reverend Dr. Chris Heckert, have tried to nail down what this method of Methodism is exactly. In a nod to Reverend Dr. Albert Outler and his theological Wesleyan Quadrilateral, we have created what we are calling the Wesleyan Practical Quadrilateral. In the same vein as Outler, we took advantage of hindsight and looked back across Wesley's entire ministry to see patterns that emerge when Wesley seeks to create community and nurture persons as true disciples of Jesus Christ who could transform the world. As we were doing this hindsight examination of Wesley, 4 patterns emerge. The first is field preaching, where this notion of taking a message of God's love outside the walls of a church to those who are most vulnerable, most outcast, and most in need of affirmation. The second is micro-communities, this forming groups of persons who gather together to hold one another accountable in and to God's love, allowing the grace of God to be present within, flowing through, and acting out from each individual. The third is social engagement, that is actually going out into the world hand in hand in Christ's love to learn from one another, to work alongside one another, and transform the world in a contextualized manner for the better. And finally, leadership activation, this recognition that everyone has gifts and graces of God that are ready and willing to be deployed in various roles. The willingness to empower persons to use those gifts and graces is up to us. Now, as Chris and I were thinking about these 4 trends that we see emerge over the course of John Wesley's ministry, and as we were thinking through how this method of Methodism or this Wesleyan Practical Quad might be useful or informative today, we also noticed a few kind of cautions when thinking about this. First, these 4, it's a method, it's not a menu. If you're going to do this method in a Wesleyan way, you have to do it all. We have some churches who excel at small group discipleship. Other churches are amazing at contextualized ministry and mission. Some are really great at training up the next generation of preachers and lay leaders. We are not saying don't do those. We are saying you also have to do the rest of it. If you are doing truly the method of Methodism, all of these components play into one another. Second, this is not a one-week thing. This is not a quick sell. It took John Wesley easily a decade to figure out this method. And third, John Wesley failed. He failed, he learned, he experimented again. He adapted his method as the needs changed. So failure is going to be a part of this as well. And that is okay. Fourth, this is highly adaptive. None of us have the same ministerial contexts. Some are in urban settings, other rural. Some have big churches, others have churches with 4 to 5 people gathered together on a Sunday. Some of us are doing campus ministry, seminary teaching, or a fresh expression. But no matter your context, we firmly believe that this method can be employed. Fifth, there is no step one. As we look at John Wesley, he, you could argue, begins with field preaching. But you do not have to begin with field preaching. It is up to you to figure out and discern God's gifts and graces in you and start there. Start with where you feel called, and then push yourself outside your own bounds to do the rest of the method. And finally, this is not a clergy-led method. Clergy have enough on their plates without trying to get them to do the whole method of Methodism. In Wesley's day, and in the development of American Methodism, it was lay-led. And this is what worked. This is what grew and sustained the movement. And so we recommend that laity take this on. I'm going to look at each piece of this method and kind of tease out a little bit more of what we're talking about. So with field preaching, as United Methodists, we have a message of liberating love. To see people free from cycles of fear, anger, and hatred. Today, behind policies that enable unjust practices and unjust systems, as well as policies that lead to the exploitation of marginalized folks, behind that, too often, is bad theology. Today, it's increasingly Christian nationalistic theology. It is this mistaken idea that, in the words of Howard Thurman, that folks lift up the religion about Jesus instead of the religion of Jesus. The primary difference between the two is that one makes belief in Jesus as God the primary goal, while the religion of Jesus takes the words of Jesus and puts them into practice seriously. It is acting out, or as Wesley would say, putting on the mind of Christ. The theology of John Wesley and those early Methodists was developed around a vision of scriptural Christianity in which Christians were to first and foremost put on the mind of Christ and walk out into the world hand in hand with one another. Micro-communities today, in this midst of loneliness, this epidemic and increasingly empathetic society, we need deeper relationships with God and with one another. Any community that is formed in our currently rapidly changing society will ultimately shift some way. We have to figure out how to keep folks engaged and connected with one another. Engaging the hurts and the needs of others outside of a group is a natural outflow of the love experienced inside of a group. It is along the margins and pressures of life that sharing love, even when difficult and uncomfortable, has the power to transform lives, communities, and the world. And like any growing movement, new components require activating new leadership. The church doesn't need a new program for training leaders, but we do need a culture, a new culture, in which people do not see positions as places to squat for power or as positions themselves, but instead constantly see new people as worthwhile investments. The work of leadership activation requires seeing God's image in each person, planting seeds in them, welcoming them into the life of the church, investing in them through fostering relationships, and ultimately setting them loose, even when it's risky. Through this method of Methodism, John Wesley was somehow able to balance being an agent of the state, an ordained clergy person, an incredibly well-educated Oxford Don, all while finding new ways of bridging the gap with the outcast, the dissenter, the unchurched, the uneducated, and the poor. In doing so, he was missionally innovative, constantly responsive, and adaptive to new needs as they emerged. The question becomes, how do we employ or embody this method today? Well, today's world isn't that different from Bristol in the 1730s and 40s. Today, social, political, and theological extremes prevent the formation of community, of vulnerability, and of joint mission. And instead, we see the replacement of these ideals with others, with nationalism, narcissism, isolation, and anxiety. A few years ago, the Surgeon General of the United States released a report entitled Our Epidemic of Loneliness and Isolation, in which he defined trending asocial and antisocial behaviors that had become endemic in our society to the point of being a public health concern. The pervasiveness of social media and the use of technology as a primary medium to interact with others, along with a decrease of civic participation, including in religious communities, has led to an increase in social anxiety and mental health problems stemming from feelings of loneliness and isolation. Today, there are other real issues that people are experiencing, including poverty, deportation, economic challenges, rampant racism and discrimination, along with physical and mental health concerns, as well as a genuine fear of what the future might hold. The issues that individuals who live all around our churches are dealing with can be heavy, and people do not always have the support systems they need to cope or to find meaning in this struggle. Rather than worrying about going to or trying to save an aging institution that seems to be irrelevant to these concerns, people are starting to look elsewhere for belonging and meaning. It is in this type of social, religious, and political environment that finding new ways of implementing the method of Methodism might allow us to be in connection with one another again. Methodism grew and was sustained because laypersons employed this method. Barbara Heck employed it when she, in Lower Manhattan, demanded that Philip Embry begin a class meeting due to spiritual lethargy in her community. Frances Willard employs it when she names alcohol as a social sin and gathers women together, teaching them how to have a public voice, and raised an entirely new generation of feminists. The Methodist Federation for Social Service employed it when they created the Social Creed, and many of our current United Methodist Caucus groups, official or unofficial, use this method to change United Methodism from the ground up. Today, the world needs good theology, rooted in the grace and love of God. Today, the world needs new forms of being in connection, a new method of watching over one another in love. Today, the world also needs permission for vile-tality. We need to find new ways for good people to break bad rules. And the United Methodist Church is at a tipping point. And we listen to where God, if we listen to where God is calling us, we might need to first submit to God. We might also need to be willing to be more vile. We might need to experiment and test out new methods, engage in new forms of technology, and going to places where we can see that God's love can be multiplied. We are at a critical moment where we must call on the fire of our heritage and our origin, reclaiming the identity of vile-tality and the method of Methodism. And y'all, this is going to require a healthy dose of spiritual gumption. Today, a way to stand up and differentiate ourselves from the increasing Christian nationalism of our nation and world just might be to take this message of God's all-encompassing, fully liberating love out into the world, to put folks in connection with one another and empower them to make a difference in their communities and in themselves. It is taking a risk on folks and knowing that God shows up most often in those we least expect. And if we dare to be a bit more vile and embody this method, we might once again become a vital witness of creating disciples of Jesus Christ through the transformation of this beautiful world.
Amen.
Amen.
Well, I'm Emily Chastain. I've probably not met a lot of you if you're alums, because you would not have been in my classes last year or this year. I'm fairly new to Perkins. Thrilled to be here. Even more thrilled. Hold on to all my stuff. Even more thrilled to have Dr. Boggan with us today. She's kind of my little, well, you're not little, but you're little. My Methodist history partner in crime. So we have lots of fun text threads asking about different things that are popping up. So I hope I get to meet you at some point. I'm a deacon from the North Alabama Conference. I worked in the North Alabama Conference for 9 years before I did my PhD. So I like to call myself a professional Methodist. And so, yeah, I'm glad to be here with you today.
Yes, great. Yeah, I'm Greta McKelvey. I'm just so honored to share the panel with you both, and just thrilled to be a part of your congregation. So thank you for having me. And yes, I suppose my contribution today would be as a Black Methodist, and I tell everybody that I'm a sixth-generation Methodist, and well, some people say we're a cradle Methodist, so that's okay too. But from my history, we all know the history. The AMEs left, the CMEs left, and there was a group of Black Methodists who stayed. And my heritage is that my family stayed. And so that's why I'm here. That's why I'm here. So yeah, my family and my ancestors, they believed in the God that they heard about. And so they stayed and they trusted the Methodist institution, right? And they said, oh, we can work with this, right? We can work within this institution. And they decided to do religion, right? And so they didn't just go to church, which is what you're talking about. They built churches. And that's why we're here. They formed their entire lives around the church and built their community, sustained their community. So yeah, great to be here. Thank you for having me.
So, well, now it's going to be mine. For a few minutes, we're going to ask Ashley some questions and kind of extend the conversation. And then we're going to open it up to some Q&A in a few minutes. So if you see my timer go off or you hear it go off, that's what that is. Ashley, I have some hot questions for you. But I have, so I'm not a cradle Methodist. I came to Methodism after God called me to ministry and my denomination said no. And I found a lot of joy in it, especially when I had to teach confirmation. And all of these answers that I had as a kid felt like they were answered. And so My father-in-law has gotten into a similar situation. So he was raised in a different tradition, and his church quit the choir. Like, they have no more choir. So now he teaches Bible study at 7 a.m. at his home church, and then walks a quarter of a mile down the street to the Methodist church, which has a choir, and it has a woman preacher, which is even more fun. And so he will ask me questions all the time. So I'm going to extend the same question that he asked me, because, you know, he's still trying to figure out what it means to be Methodist. I've given him Ted Campbell's small book on Methodist history and Methodist polity and doctrine. He tried Randy Maddox, and it was a lot. So I'm with you. It is. But, you know, with everything going on today, there's lots of things that I'm sure you deal with people saying they don't feel like that is what Methodist or Wesleyan. And so I'm going to make this vague, but also ask this question. Do you feel that today's United Methodist Church is aligned with Wesley's theology and practice? I didn't tell her about this question.
I'm worried I might get fired if I say no. I think there are still remnants of both the theology and practice. I do. I think the United Methodist Church still puts love above most other things, not necessarily all things, but most other things. Where I think we have gotten away from Wesley is in the systems that we've created. We have over-politized, is that a word? Politized ourselves to where we can no longer do the adaptive, responsive, missional changes that Wesley was able to do. Because for Wesley, it was just a means of finding another person to respond to that missional need, or gathering persons together to meet. He didn't have to go through church council and then your charge conference and all of the other layers that we've added. So I think one of the ways that we've gotten away from Wesley is through this over-structuralization, I guess, of United Methodism. And that's another thing that we're trying to kind of tease with this in-connection versus connectionalism. You know, if we describe ourselves as a people in connection with one another, that says more, at least in my mind, about a relationship that I want to have with another individual or with a community. When I use the word connectionalism, most people look at me like, did you just make that word up? And it describes the system. So I do think that theology is still there. But we have over-institutionalized to the point to where the theology can't be lived out in a truly adaptive and responsive way.
Preach on.
Well, I'm reminded about the laity role. I'm so sorry, yeah. I'm reminded about the laity role as definitely my interest lies. And I just simply want to share a story. We're part of this Black Methodist Church history book project, so sorry. And so in my research, journal research, and interviews with people, one of the stories that I discovered was that here, south of Dallas in Paris, Texas, the church began because of a seasonal cotton pick. And so the lay people who formed the church would travel to Paris every cotton picking season. And so there they were in the field having church. They were singing as they worked, they prayed as they worked, right? And sure enough, they saved enough money and formed their first shotgun house. And there in the house, they took their religion, their church, inside the walls of their house. And as fate would have it, soon enough, a preacher came along, right? But the church was established with laity. And so, in your living out our faith.
So, I constantly go back to history for answers, so I'm always going to make a historic reference. One of the things that, I think not only with the story that you shared, Greta, but also when we look at how Methodism spread kind of throughout the Americas, and even probably beyond America too, it is through laity. It is, usually just like you described, right? There's a preacher arrives on a horse, and to find that Methodists are already there, it's like, okay. Today, where we see, I'll do this, where we see the shift from kind of that form of Methodism to what we have now is really when circuit riders stopped circuit riding, right? They wanted to settle down, get married, have a family, and probably, if I was asked to ride 400 miles on a horse every year, I'd probably want to stop at some point too. But when they stopped, what ends up happening is the laity stopped going to one another for community and for resources and for spiritual care and discernment and prayer. And they started going to the preacher. And over decades, this became the habit to where if you need something in terms of your spiritual life, you go to your preacher. If you want to do something new in your church, you feel like you have to get the permission of your preacher. Now, I am a laywoman. I intentionally am a laywoman because I don't like to rely upon the rules of people higher than me in order to do something. So I always encourage lay persons to, if you are feeling God pulling you somewhere, do it. Do not ask your clergy person for permission. Do not wait for your clergy person to find someone else to do it. You go do it. And then, if it works, do not let your clergy take credit for it. But I do think that we've almost got into this kind of polite society where it's assumed that if I want to do anything in my church context, I have to have the preacher behind me or in front of me, right? And that's just not how Methodism began or spread or was sustained.
You gave me a really good lead up into this question. I think you knew this too. So I picked up something on your talk where you talked about you cannot submit to God's call if you want to be settled, right? I didn't do it verbatim, but it was, and I thought about as soon as she said that, I was like, it's interesting, when I teach United Methodist history, we always talk about, mid 19th century, and this is really when Methodism starts to change, right? In America specifically, you have a lot more pastors being settled, right? We literally call it that. Like, this is the point where pastors start settling. They move to an area, and they really like this area, and they don't want to leave this area, and they establish families. You see where I'm going with this, right? And we've even gotten so entrenched in that pattern of itineracy now that as we are having to merge with other conferences and our itineracy window has widened, a lot of people don't want to move. I'm going to hit a button here in Dallas too, I just realized, because you buy a house, I lived in New England too, and in California the same problem. You buy a house and you can't buy a house everywhere because churches don't have parsonages. And so we're getting into this stickiness, right, of this movement, right? I don't know if it's the clergy that settled first, the laity that settled first. We're not going to settle that today. But I am curious, actually, if, the movement you just talked about with laity depending more on clergy becoming more settled, I actually have like a few questions. Like, is there a bishop in there? Okay. Do we need a fresher understanding of itineracy? And then also, what obstacles do you see currently that are because you're a layperson and you can say these things, and nobody's going to call my DS if I answer it. What obstacles do you see in keeping our itineracy effective to the state that Wesley had it?
I do think we need to re-examine itineracy, just like we need to re-examine connectionalism. I mean, it's kind of these core aspects that built the movement, but today's social, political, religious world is very different than it was in Wesley's day or in early 19th century America. So I'm not trying to say that history is like this nostalgic lens, and if we just do what they used to do, we'll fix everything. No, but there are lessons there that we can play with, and we can adapt and wrestle with and learn from and experiment with. So like one of the things, I'll tell you a personal story and then I'll kind of get into that. So both my parents were ordained clergy persons in the Arkansas Conference, and they served together the same church for 20 years. So I grew up a double PK who never moved. It wasn't until I went to college that they were relocated. And that was because the church was growing, my dad and mom were happy there, the church was happy with them. They knew that me and my sister had made community. When my dad was finally moved, the church split. And that's what happens when you don't live into itineracy in the way that it is meant to be, right? Some persons got really attached to my dad's preaching and my mom's music. And when that changed, they walked out. And we see this happen time and time and time again. I don't think we all need to be circuit riders riding 400 miles on a horse or a car or any of that. But how do we make sure that the movement of United Methodism keeps going because the laity are running it and it's not dependent upon the clergy person casting a new vision, creating a new systemic plan, or strategic plan, and living into that. And then when that pastor moves, everything goes upside down and you have a whole nother version of that. So I think that's where we need to kind of look at itinerancy. And then another kind of flip side to this that is a stark difference from early itinerancy is that I would argue that today the laity are almost more itinerant than clergy. Right? Like, I think since I graduated college, I have lived in 12 different cities. I'm not going to tell you how many years, but a couple decades, we'll just go with that. So how do we continue to do ministry with a laity that's itinerant and a clergy that's settled? How does that affect itinerancy? I don't have the answer to that. It is just a curiosity.
Okay, we're gonna open it up to you if you have any questions. And we have Kaylee walking around with the microphone. So if you do have a question, I encourage you, please use the microphone as an issue of accessibility.
Actually, I want to say, the first time I heard you speak was here in Dallas, Greenland Hills, when they gave the clergy reconciling group. So that was the first time. And then I went online and found a history discussion that you did, a video, and I used it for a confirmation class. So I am familiar with you. So my question has to do with coming from your book. This is 106. But the church has experienced trauma between COVID and disaffiliation. I mean, talk about trauma. And it's hard to get your wheels back under you. You want to go inside, close the doors. And then you find that you're all 80 and older and nobody's coming and knocking on the door. How do you pry open the door and acknowledge the trauma? Acknowledge the trauma, but open the doors, go outside They truly are. So, your question to you.
You could say what my niece says. Go outside and touch grass, right?
I mean, it is a good question, right? Of how do we do this? And I will say, like, since I wrote that, I'm seeing inklings, and I don't want to jinx the United Methodist Church, so someone knock on some wood or something. But I'm seeing inklings that we are beginning to open the doors to hard conversations that we haven't had. So, for instance, when the AME Zion, and the CME, when those were formed, and even when the Wesley Connection in America and the Methodist Protestants, the through line of the Methodist Episcopal Church didn't change because those groups left. They just stayed the course, right? They didn't take a firm stance on slavery. They refused to change the episcopacy. They refused to kind of give laypersons more official leadership. And they didn't change because they were scared of losing more people. I do see a difference with the United Methodist Church of 2025. With disaffiliation and after COVID, we did take the bold step to make some big changes. Changes that are still coming out with regionalization just passing last week, or being announced that passing last week. And so I have a lot of hope that we're opening that door. And I hope as we open that door that we do the self-reflection and name the times when we've done harm and the places where we refuse to change and repent for those so that we can move forward in a more reconciled or truly authentic or holy conferencing way. I have a lot of hope for this 2026 leadership gathering that the Council of Bishops is putting on, that may be a new way to hear new voices. I have hope that the 2028 General Conference will continue to kind of live into not being afraid to make bold statements and make bold decisions out of fear of losing people. I don't know if I have it in the book, but whenever you put membership or numbers or vile-tality above mission, your mission's fruitless, right? And so how do we find the gumption to be brave enough to make bold statements because it's aligned with our mission, and realize that that actually might be attractive to folks?
I'm not a United Methodist, and so it's interesting hearing about the practical quadrilateral. I would actually propose that the practical quadrilateral has actually been stolen and has become the forefront of Christian nationalism, just with different labels in that quadrilateral piece. So I think it's a successful model. I think what I'm concerned about is that as denominations continue to die, and the Christian nationalism, which I refuse to call Christian at all, but is nationalism in a supremacy way, is how do we begin to align mainline Protestant churches beyond our denominational names and affiliations in order to reclaim what is actually Christian and to stop this creep of allowing the Christian gospel to be hijacked in the same way that John did in Great Britain, where, of course, I'm from, and did it at Bristol actually. So how do we begin to break down these denominational hierarchies that have just bleh Christianity, and actually reclaim this practical quadrilateral regardless of the denomination, so that we can, in actual fact, reclaim Christianity for the USA and for the world?
I mean, that's a really big question. I would immediately, like, my immediate response is collective witness, right? How do we show up in spaces that are contested and show up in and through and embodying God's love above anything and everything else? And so, you know, in National Guard is, where ICE is doing mass deportations. How do we show up and actually make sanctuaries sanctuary? How do we, right, assuming if you are a person who is a U.S. citizen and you have that privilege, how do you put your body as a barrier to prevent some of this nationalistic politics from being implemented? And I think John Wesley would have done that. I have no doubt in my mind that he would be marching down different streets at the No Kings protests and all of this stuff. And I do agree with you that the method has kind of been stolen. One of the pieces we put in the Calling on Fire book is how non-denominational churches use this method. And it spreads like wildfire. There's a church in New Jersey called Liquid Church, and this is all that they do. They don't have an actual building. They meet in different spaces. They form micro-communities. They put people in, they get them involved in their community, and then they release them to go form another micro-community. The thing we have to do is name that and say, that's what Wesley did. And do that work of naming and educating. Because the method does work. And we have to remind folks. And some non-denominational churches actually do give Wesley credit for the way that they do mission ministry, but not all. But yeah, collective witness, I would say, is the best one.
If I can add, it is connected to collective witness, but I think for those of you who are clergy in the room, it's really re-empowering the laity. It is decentralizing power of the clergy, of the bishops, of all of these power structures that have been built up in every denomination as this kind of piece of prestige, right? Wesley was an Anglican clergy person, but he saw that the church, the institution, and the power that was there was not going to revive the world that he was living in. So he went outside of that. He empowered people, just like Ashley was talking about. And so I think it is collective witness, but it's also clergy decentralizing their power in congregations and literally giving it to the laity.
So, interesting comment, because my question has to do with that, actually. And if it doesn't make sense, you can ask me to rephrase it. So as clergy, I love the idea of handing over authority to laity. One of the things that I have noticed and experienced is in certain avenues and in certain missions and ministries, handing over responsibility to the laity can inadvertently encourage them to make it theirs, rather than the collective mission or ministry of the church and how it aligns with our call as a church. How do clergy walk that line of giving authority, but also making sure it continues to stay aligned with the rest of our church and not becoming the quote-unquote baby of a specific group of laity?
Yeah, great question. That's where I would say thinking about what it means to be in connection could be useful. Because it's not just, I'll give an example. So I'm employing this method in my local church. I have a group of moms with kids all still at home. We all live in Madison, New Jersey. We go to Madison UMC, so we call ourselves the Mad Mamas. And we get together once a month, because that's when our schedule allows, and try to find, we ask the basic question of how is it with your soul? That's what we do each month. And the fear is that, and I've had this open conversation with my pastor, he doesn't want this to be the Ashley Boggan group. I don't want this to be the Ashley Boggan group. I travel too much and I don't have enough time for it to be that. So talking about the work that we're doing in the Mad Mamas, the spiritual work, the missional work, with other people in the church community, and encouraging them to also do that. We've thrown around some really fun names that I'm sure if you think about alliteration, you could figure out what we're doing for papas that would be analogous to Mad Mamas, but I'm not going to go there. But how do you kind of take the methodology of what's working and replicate it within your community? and so when we do mission as a Mad Mamas, we don't do it only in our group, right? We're pulling people from the congregation to do it. We're going out and supporting mission that the church is doing. So it's thinking through the various the various threads of being in connection with one another, so that it's not just that group over there who claims they're associated with this church, but we never see them or we're not invited to their thing.
How does the clergy person get into the laity? Well, a couple things come to mind. Being a cradle Methodist, we used to say that it was only the Baptists who kept their preachers for a lifetime. And the Methodists had this method of removing their pastors. And a few, how do you call it in your book? A few good people breaking bad rules. And so that's what we do. A few good people break bad rules. And because it's about we the people, right? And so when we the people decide that the system or the person or whatever doesn't work for our church and our community, what do? A few good people break bad rules. And so we have a way in the Methodist Church to remove whatever, thank goodness, that's not working. And so I think Ashley is encouraging us to be courageous and to stand out for Wesleyanism. And so we a few good people break bad rules, and so we remove things that don't work. We have the courage and the strength and the know-how in the church to do so. Amen. Amen.
So I was just curious, Michael Beck's not in the room today, he was yesterday. But I just wonder how you see the Fresh Expressions movement and what this history might inform how Methodists do Fresh Expressions.
John Wesley was the original Fresh Expressions. It was a reform and renewal movement within the Church of England. And so, I always get really frustrated with certain church leaders who refuse to fund Fresh Expressions ministries. Because to me, there's nothing more Methodist than the idea of a fresh expression. Of doing church in sometimes a kooky, creative, outside-the-box way. That is what it means to be Methodist, right? John Wesley allowed lay people to preach. He allowed women to preach. He's forming all of these bands and classes and having love feasts and watch nights, and all of this stuff that was seen as super weird by the Church of England. But it worked. And so I think Fresh Expressions, I know we can't rebrand it at this point, but I wish we could rebrand it to just, this is what it means to be Methodist. That's not as catchy, but something along the lines of just naming it as, this is how we started. It is new and radical for the United Methodist Church, but it's us reliving this method.
First of all, thank you so much for your work and what you're doing in our movement right now. Thanks also for this practical quadrilateral, really helpful in terms of where I think we see our churches going. I'd love to hear you say a little bit more about what you think field preaching is in the 21st century, in 2025, and to that extent, what does laity doing field preaching look like in 2025?
Yeah, so I have another version of this talk where I do kind of define these things in a little bit more detail, especially for 2025. Field preaching in today's world is not literally going into the fields. If you have a lovely field in your community and you feel God pulling you there, go for it. But I like to think of it more as some sort of content creation. There are some really amazing laypersons, I don't even know if they're academics, on TikTok who have deep spiritual discussions in 3 minutes. So, right, how do you do content creation or taking the message of God's love to a place that needs to hear it? So field preaching can also be, I know when I've talked with folks, there are people who go to train stations and do communion or just stand there and pray with people. That is a form of field preaching, right? It is showing up in an unexpected place and offering a message of God's love. Podcasts. I mean, good Lord, how many churches and clergy and bishops have podcasts these days, right? That can be a form of field preaching too. So it's anything that's taking that message and proclaiming it outside the walls of the church.
And we're seeing that in my circle. We're seeing more field preaching, if you will. We're seeing it in online, family Bible studies even, branches of family, talking about the Word of God. Intentionally, we're seeing circles after worship service, continuing to talk about the message they heard that day. Field preaching. And if you read United Methodist News, props to you and Pal, there's some really interesting fresh expressions out there that are experimenting with field preaching. So one of my favorite is Nerd Pastor Nate I think he's in North Carolina. He has gaming church. And so they all get online at the same time and are in the same digital gaming world and do church. There's even a United Methodist church now on Reddit. Right? Like, to me, that's like, okay, like, I don't know how you do that, but I'm really glad that somebody's figured out how to do that. Right? So it's just getting creative and experimenting.
So I have a question on the practical quadrilateral, and I think I love it. I absolutely love it. My question is, I'm going to ask a question, and I'm going to kind of back it up with an opportunity. So the question is, where does nurture fall into the quadrilateral? And I ask because we're finding that I'm CME, like I think I was born on the 4th row of the church that I'm in their own way. And now we're finding to get the young adults into the church, they want to be able to bring in what they're experiencing outside of the church. Good quality things, but we're having to now tie that to the Methodism. And so to keep it from being this tension between the spiritual and, are we spiritual, religious, that conversation, being able to nurture that, not to say, oh, that's bad, like the bishop, that you can't have that here, but where do you find nurture when those conversations come up? Because they're real.
I'm gonna go back to my Mad Mamas previous. It's a space where we've done a lot of experimentation, and a lot of us in that group. See, it's me and the preacher's wife, who's also a deacon. We were probably the two who are invested in the United Methodist Church the most. We were members of the church. The 5 or 6 others were really suspicious about joining an institutional church. They liked the way that, the pastor preached. They liked that kids kind of run around the sanctuary, but beyond that, there was nothing connecting them, doing that nurturing of their faith, and of kind of affirming their experiences in daily life. So with this group, like the reason that we ask, how is it with your soul? It's not only because that's the Wesleyan historic question. It's because it's a weird question to ask. When you ask someone, how are you? Most of the time, we probably have a rehearsed answer, right? I'm fine. Kids are great, work's fine. I'm good. That's not the truth, usually. Right? But when you ask someone, how is it with your soul, it's inviting deeper levels of intimacy and vulnerability and creating a space where you can nurture one another, where you can walk alongside one another. And we've seen it slowly over the last year that when you create that space for vulnerability, eventually, and this has happened, people start talking about their faith. It's no longer, I'll be honest, when we started this group, it was a whole lot of just complaining about husbands. It happens. But now it's actually, we're having spiritual conversations. We're trying to find ways that we can make a difference in our community as a collective. And in the Wesleyan form of discipleship, right, nurturing your faith isn't just you working out your stuff with God, it's you getting out there and being amongst people. And so we're doing that work in that micro community. And for me, that's probably the part where it happens most often. Because field preaching, it can happen, but usually that is awakening someone or the catalyst for a future conversation. It's not that space, you have to have that small group or that micro community space to really dig deep and talk through things. Soul care, yes, yes. Soul care.
We're asking similarly, we're asking, what fruit of the Spirit are you practicing today or this week?
Thank you. Would you help me thank Ashley once again? Thank you, Emily, as well. Well, don't go anywhere too far. I want to let you stretch your legs, take a final break, and then you don't want to miss our closing worship service. About 15 minutes, and we will close out with communion. So be here. We'll have you out in time, but we look forward to celebrating all that has happened in our time together. So we'll see you in just a few minutes. Thank you.